This is Paul Johnson with the Optimistic American. I think you're going to like our show today with Dustin Wahl. Now, Dustin has an illustrious past. He actually went to Liberty University and was one of the guys looking to try to reform that university. Today, he's the deputy director of an organization called Fix Our House, which is focused on trying to create proportional representation in the United States Congress. Now, this show will describe exactly how that works, but it's one of the many reform efforts that are out there trying to talk about how to fix our broken system. Dustin has been featured in a number of different publications throughout this country, including the New Yorker, MSNBC, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and even BBC. His talk is fun. I think you'll enjoy it. And if you like what it is that we're doing, push that subscribe button. We'd love to have you as a member. Well, Dustin, I'd like to welcome you to the Optimistic American today, and thanks for taking the time to come onto our program.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
All right. So I am going to jump right to the million-dollar question with your organization, Fix Our House, which is how is it that we develop more options for voters? I know that you're spending a lot of time on reform efforts. We're doing that as well. But I'd like to know your view of how it is that we actually increase the amount of options that voters have today.
Yeah, it's a great question, and like you said, something that we care a lot about at Fix Our House. So I not to answer your question in an indirect way, but we're focused first and foremost on a reform called proportional representation for the U.S. Congress. And if that sounds like a sort of an indirect and boring way to get more parties and more options for Americans, that's very understandable. But we think that this is actually the crucial reform that could get us to a multi-party democracy in America, where voters have more choices, more options, and feel like their party more closely represents them. So the way that that would work, and the way that it works in so many other countries around the world, has to do with just how our elections work, and the number of parties a country has that are viable and competing for control of the government is determined to a great degree by the way that that country conducts its elections. So America uses a winner-take-all system to elect Congress, where everyone just has one representative, and that representative's goal is to get more votes than the other side, and if they do, they win the seat. If you win with 51% of the vote, you win 100% of the seat, because there's only one seat to win. And so if your opponent won 49% of the vote, well, that's tough. They go home empty-handed with nothing, right? And that's kind of the water we swim in America. That kind of system is normal to us. But about 80% of the countries in the world, 80% of democratic countries in the world use a system of proportional representation, which simply put is a system where a party's amount of support determines its number of seats in Congress. So to use the U.S. as an example, right now in a state like Massachusetts, Massachusetts has 9 representatives in the U.S. House. They're all Democrats in Massachusetts. And that might make sense because, well, Massachusetts is a liberal Democratic state, so of course they have more Democrats there. But about a third of Massachusetts consistently votes for Republicans. About a third of the state voted for Trump in 2020. Those Republicans don't make up a majority of any one of the congressional districts in Massachusetts. And so because they don't have a majority in any one of those 9 districts, they have 0% of their state's representatives in Congress. Even though, again, they make up about a third of the state. The same is true in Oklahoma or Arkansas, where, in Oklahoma, all 5 of the state's representatives are Republicans, even though Democrats make up about a third of the state. Same is true in Arkansas. The same is true in a number of states. So this is what we get in a winner-take-all system, where a party, controls much of the congressional delegation or the entire delegation because of winner-take-all elections. In a proportional system, Massachusetts might have um, two districts with 5 representatives in one and 4 in the other, or 3 districts with 3 representatives in each one, elected in proportion to their party's amount of support. So if the Republicans win 30% of the vote, they would get about 30% of the seats. If Democrats in Oklahoma get 40% of the vote, they get about 40% of the seats, right? And this allows you to have more conservative representation in liberal areas, more liberal representation in conservative areas, and everything in between. And it gets rid of the spoiler effect in politics, where if a third party tries to run in one of these districts today, they're just pulling votes away from the party that's closest to them, because again, the goal in a winner take all election is to get to that 50% plus one threshold that you need to get to win the seat. If you have more representatives per district, and therefore more seats to be won, then the threshold to win those seats is lower. And so you can, again, win a seat with 30% of the vote or 20% of the vote. And that incentivizes the creation of new parties. It makes the creation of new parties viable and possible, whereas it's very, very, very hard in a system like ours in America to get viable new parties off the ground. You can have independents run, as we've seen before in the United States, but um, the difference there is you don't have the sort of party infrastructure that comes along with an independent run, and it's very expensive. It's also harder for voters to know what their independent candidate necessarily believes, because they don't have that natural policy, connection to a major party. They don't have labels to sort of inform voters, like, here's what we might believe on a given issue. And so it's much harder to do, and much I think worse for a democratic country to just rely purely on independents, battling it out. And again, we think that the best way to get to a multi-party system is through this kind of unique reform to how House elections work, and that would then spread and make the creation of new parties more possible in America. That was a long answer to get to your question, but
it needs a long answer, and I have some questions in that. So let's start
yeah.
with the president and the Senate. Would those elections stay as is under your current proposed reform?
Yes, yeah, they would, and those, the presidency for instance, is obviously there's only one seat there, so you can't divide that and elect it proportionally. And same with the Senate. Now, the Senate is already consists of multi-member districts where everyone has more than one senator right now. So it shows that there is some precedent in America for having multiple representatives electing or representing, a given area. But yeah, those would stay the same. However, again, if you have a new party that pops up in, say, Massachusetts, moderate conservative uh, party that isn't maybe Trumpy, but that isn't also politically liberal. That party in Massachusetts could then become more viable, so that you'd have people running from that party for Senate in Massachusetts. So then you get multi-party democracy spreading into the Senate as well.
So would this reform require a constitutional amendment, or is it something that could be done through legislative action?
Yeah, that's a great question. It doesn't require a constitutional amendment, which we think is one of the big um, key reasons why we support it. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to change how congressional elections work. And so this would fall under that. The U.S. has not used proportional representation to elect its Congress before, but in the founding era, there were a lot of multi-member districts where, again, a given area had multiple representatives representing that one space. So there's precedent for it in our history, and we could do this with just simple legislation. Now I know that like when you say just simple legislation, getting anything passed today is very difficult. Maybe we can talk more about kind of our strategy to that end, but it's not as big of a lift as changing the Constitution by any means.
All right. So why don't you give us your strategy? I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. Uh, so, and I also just I want to make to the last point we were talking about. To add to that, there's also quite a bit of precedent for this in early American history. In fact, the earliest form of proportional representation that was kind of debated in the United States was called Jeffersonian voting because it was a system that Jefferson had talked a lot about. So there's the founders said a lot about the problem with dividing into just two parties. And so we think that there's a lot of support there for this. In terms of getting this accomplished, we think that change happens slowly and then all at once. To paraphrase the Hemingway quote, and we think that the situation in Washington right now makes passing any legislation, especially big legislation, very difficult. This is a solution that directly addresses some of the core problems that our country is facing, like extreme polarization and dysfunction in Congress, which would get easier in this kind of a system because compromise would be incentivized. And that this is a reform that directly addresses those things. And so our goal is to share proportional representation with members of Congress and members of the media, folks in DC, decision makers, and people across the country that are curious and looking for big solutions to the big problems that we're facing, so that when a window for reform opens at some point in the future, that may be 10 years from now, that may be sooner in response to something that changes in our politics, this solution is sort of well understood and baked and ready to just be pulled off the shelf and plugged into the problem that we're facing. Because again, things, it's really easy to point to the system today and say, man, this is stuck. There's we can't even pass, we can hardly pass a law to keep the government open, much less significantly change how our system works. But as one of our Fix Our Houses co-founders, Lee Drutman, has said, brittleness or stubbornness has a lot in common with brittleness, meaning when a system is very inflexible, that often means that it's ready to break and be replaced. And so whether we have some kind of good positive period of reform, open up new possibilities in America, or whether it's some kind of democratic crisis that makes us really look inward and examine our system, we think we need to be prepared as a country to build towards the kind of reforms that actually address the core problems that we're facing, rather than kind of sit on our hands right now and say, well, we can't pass this now, and so we might as well not talk about it.
So here's my question. I'm deeply involved in reform efforts throughout the US that are looking at opening up the primaries, where everyone would run in an open primary. And then you wouldn't run based upon party. You'd just decide that you wanted to run and you'd run against all the other candidates. It's very similar to what we do in city elections. 70% of the cities throughout the US use that system. What that does is it takes the parties out of being control on the front part. Now, the back end may be a top 2 or it might be a top 5 with the ranked choice voting. I'd love to know your thoughts on whether or not you see that as being helpful or harmful to your efforts, and any criticisms or other comments that you may have about the system itself.
Yeah. No, that's a great question, and it's cool that you're working on those kinds of reforms. So first of all, I think that anything in the conversation about electoral reform in the United States is extremely important. There's a bunch of different reform options being floated around right now in the United States, and all of it is good and important, and we need to be having that conversation and debate about which which reforms to our system of election are better, which have better results, which are doing better in other countries where they're using them. This is an incredibly important conversation to be having right now, and so even if there's ultimate disagreement over what the best option is, we're absolutely allies in the overall need to change the way that our elections work and change the incentive structure. And to your point, I think open primaries do that in some really positive ways. However, I think they don't enjoy some of the uh, same ultimate positive effects as proportional representation. For instance, it opening up your primary system doesn't incentivize the creation of more parties in the same way that moving to multi-member districts and proportional representation does. It doesn't necessarily um, uh, make it easier to solve what we refer to as the doom loop happening in Washington D.C. right now, where the stakes keep getting higher and the parties pull further and further apart, and legislating is not incentivized and performative conflict is incentivized. This is something that is only solved by breaking out of the winner take all, us versus them binary approach to elections, um, that is just natural in any kind of election where there's only one winner. And so moving to a system of multi-member districts, I think, is kind of the gold standard. That's what I would argue. However, I think, again, I think there's the benefits that you shared are real, and in California and Washington and some places that use a top two voting system where two advance or four advance from the primary to the general election. Alaska uses one as well. Um, those are it's good that states are experimenting with that and trying to see what benefits can come from it. But I would certainly advocate for those states, to particularly California and Washington, that have a lot of representatives, to begin experimenting with proportional representation to multi-member districts for the House. And I think the crucial thing there is, um, it's really easy to look at the problems in our two-party system and blame parties in general, because we're unsatisfied with Republicans, we're unsatisfied with Democrats, and just say the concept of parties is bad. I think that's natural, and that's an easy thing to do. It's certainly precedented in American history. Americans tend to be very independent minded, and that's good. Um, but again, I kind of hit on this earlier. I would argue that parties, as much as they carry all kinds of baggage with them, political parties themselves are very important. They're kind of the organizing building blocks of a rational democratic system, because most people don't have the time, the bandwidth to educate themselves on every independent, or every independent candidate running on their ballot, and every single thing that they believe on a given issue. The party label helps um, to communicate to voters some information about what kind of policy environment that candidate would bring with them if elected. Now, having just two parties is very bad and creates this kind of doom loop where each party is trying to do everything they can just to defeat the other, and again, the incentive is not to legislate, it's to fight. That's a bad system, but I think uh, the necessary fix is not no parties or less parties. It's more parties, and it's looking at reforms that political science shows will result in in more parties being able to form. Opening up the primary process is kind of an anti-party reform, because it takes the selection of candidates away from political parties. So this is kind of an ongoing debate in the reform community, and so that would be my 2 cents for why I think proportional representation is preferable. But again, really important debate to be having, and I appreciate what reformers are doing in Washington, California, other places that are trying this, and what you're doing as well.
So I heard you make the comment about the doom loop. I like that analogy. I also have heard you give the Thanksgiving analogy. I think that's a good one. And if you would, why don't you use that and explain to me what you mean when you give the analogy of the Thanksgiving dinner?
Yeah. So this is something that actually we at Fix Our House didn't come up with. Another organization that's a partner of ours, Protect Democracy, came up with this idea to explain proportional representation. What they did is they uh, asked, let's imagine what it would be like to plan Thanksgiving dinner using the same system that we currently use to elect Congress, which sounds kind of funny. But again, if you think about it, in the current system, the candidate who gets the most votes wins, right? Even if you only win by a little bit. If you get 51%, you win. And you get 100% of the seats. So imagine if we chose Thanksgiving dinner dishes that way. Well, what Protect Democracy and another group called Citizen Data did is they conducted some polling where they divided America into different regions and asked a question to lots of people living in that region, which was, "What's your favorite Thanksgiving dinner dish?" And what they found is every region chose either turkey or stuffing. So if we elected Congress, rather, if we elected Thanksgiving dinner dishes with the same system that we use to elect Congress, we'd have a Thanksgiving dinner table with just two options on it, just turkey and stuffing. Just like we have a Congress with just two options, Republicans and Democrats. And you can kind of see how, in the nature of that kind of election system, um, you know, that kind of result is baked in, and it would be a bland Thanksgiving dinner. Personally, I love mashed potatoes, and I look forward to mashed potatoes and pie. Uh, every Thanksgiving, and there would be no representation at all for dishes like that. If we were to use a proportional system and calculate the same results from Protect Democracy and Citizen Data's poll using a proportional form of election, then stuffing maybe gets 40% of the vote. It gets about 40% of the places on the table. Turkey gets 30% of the vote. It gets 30% of the places on the table, and so on and so forth. And so you'd have a dinner table that looks more like Americans' actual dinner tables, that's more diverse, that has more options on it. Because again, the threshold to win a seat isn't just you have to win more than your opponent, and you have to win the most. And if you do, then you win the whole place at the table. But it's how much support does this thing actually have, and let's give it representation in proportion to its amount of support.
All right. And so tell me the process that you're going through to get this done. What activities and what strategy are you putting into place to try to help implement this?
Yeah. So a lot of our work is actually focused on Washington, D.C. And we think that it's crucial and important to do work all throughout the country to spread awareness of this kind of thing. But we're mostly focused on D.C. because we want to educate lawmakers, first and foremost, so that they know this is an option. It's very hard to um, you know explain and get into the details with 330 million Americans about electoral reform, right? It's complicated. It takes a long time, and we think that most voters, um, want a better system with fairer representation, and don't have the time to work through all the political science about figuring out what the best you know scientific system is going to create those results. And to some degree, there is a role for decision makers and influencers in Washington to say, okay, here's a plan that would actually do that. And we've met with dozens of offices on Capitol Hill in the last couple of years, and I know Congress is not popular for very good reasons, but there are a lot of members of Congress that understand the problem just as well as the rest of the country does, and see how hard it is to get anything accomplished there, and are willing to zoom out and look at, it may not be possible right now, but let's prepare these kinds of reforms that could get us to a more functional system, that's better for them, that's better for the country. So we've been pleased. I've honestly been pleasantly surprised with um, how much willingness there is in Congress and in Washington to consider this kind of a major shift in our political thinking.
Have you thought about a
That'll
state
be
strategy?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I was just about to say that all being said, states can do this themselves right now for their state legislature. There's a law that says it's called the Uniform Congressional District Act from 1967, and that keeps states from electing their members of the U.S. House with proportional representation. It mandates single winner districts like we have today, but it doesn't mandate that for state legislatures. So there are efforts underway across the country to do this at a state level. We're a national organization. We're allied and very supportive of these state and local efforts, but our focus is on DC. But there's a movement in California called Pro Rep California, proportional representation for that state. They're focused on getting a ballot initiative to try to get multi-member districts with proportional representation on the ballot at some point in California. There are efforts in other states as well. Portland, Oregon, just became the largest city in the U.S. to use proportional representation to elect its city council. They voted on that last year, and the city chose to move to a proportional system. So that was a big win at the local level. And having more of these local and state examples will be crucial to moving it up the chain, and getting action at the federal level. Where if you get proportional representation at the federal level, that's where you would really start to see the benefit for multi-party democracy beginning to flourish and be viable.
All right, so I'm going to dig into your past to try to understand this a little bit. I know that I believe you went to Liberty University and that you had
Yeah.
another organization that you were involved with. And one of the things that I read that I didn't really understand was a comment that was made that part of the efforts that you had taken on were to hold Liberty University accountable. I wasn't
Mm.
certain how that played into this entire mix. Maybe you could help me understand that.
Yeah. No, that's a good. I do think about these two different projects that I've worked on as being similar in some ways. So yeah, like you said,
What
I
was the
went to
name of the
Liberty
other
University.
project?
Yeah. So Save 71 was an organization that I founded as a graduate from Liberty. I went there from 2014 to 2018, and just background on me, I grew up very politically conservative, and really wanted to go to Liberty, which is this very conservative university in Virginia. It's a evangelical conservative university. And long story short, while I was there, the school had a lot of um, dysfunction, a lot of problems. Its president was very hypocritical, and uh, not willing to listen to dissent. So there, we could spend three more podcast interviews just talking about all the crazy stuff that was going on at Liberty, but um, violations of free speech, and you get that at other campuses too. But Falwell was using his platform as the president of Liberty to enrich himself and some of his buddies that are still in Liberty's administration, at the at the harm of the students, in my opinion. And so I started this organization, Save 71, to advocate for Falwell's removal, and accountability for some of the other executives at the school. The school is currently being investigated for one of the things we had raised awareness about, which was uh, the fact that they don't comply with federal law when it comes to reporting crimes on campuses, particularly sexual assaults. The Department of Education is investigating them for that right now. And so again, that all seems very different from advocating for multi-party democracy in America and this change in electoral reform. But it's similar in that when I was at Liberty in 2016, Falwell, the school's president, was this prominent endorser of Donald Trump, and helped try to sell Donald Trump to evangelical Christians and say this man is one of us and is good, and and you should vote for him. And I remember the primary, the Republican primary in 2016. Marco Rubio won the Liberty campus precinct with 44% of the vote. Trump got 7% of the vote on Liberty's campus precinct. Now, this is one of the most conservative precincts in America. And in March 2016, Trump got 7% of the vote there. That had totally flipped by Election Day 2016. And basically what I saw and felt happen was, a lot of people that had, serious problems with the guy coming around and saying, well, he's the lesser of two evils for me. He's not as bad as Hillary Clinton, and so I'm going to vote for him. And I personally, I disagreed with that, but I certainly understood the logic. And that's real logic that you have to employ when you have a race with just one winner. When you have more possibilities, more potential winners, more potential representatives, you lose that lesser of two evils dynamic and motivation. You have, as Lee Drutman, one of our co-founders, says, there's no such thing as the lesser of three evils or five evils, right? You're not just voting against the other side. You're voting for your own side because you don't have the spoiler effect threatening to actually inadvertently help the side that you really don't want to see elected. And so I did experience that kind of thing firsthand at Liberty, and really saw how it could be really harmful to orient yourself primarily around what you oppose. And that we need a system that builds more options for Americans who feel politically homeless right now, as many people in evangelical conservative areas still do.
All right, so I've got a lot I've got to unpack with this. This is very interesting to me. So the first point that I would make, just something to add to the conversation. I had a pollster. I spent a lot of time in politics. I've been involved with a number of presidential campaigns. I've been very active in the political environment. I had a pollster who once told me I was trying to talk about how we could be more aspirational, talk about the things that we wanted to get. And the pollster said to me, look, you really you're not paying attention to how primaries work. Here's how our election system works in the United States. The very first thing that we have to do is we have to make certain that we terrify the public about the opposition. We have to terrify them about them. And that's because what happens is that engages the amygdala, the primitive part of the brain that says that my tribe's under attack, we're under attack by this other side who is an evil force. And once you get them to believe that, they'll listen to nothing they have to say. Now, what we need to do is to go, according to this pollster, as far left as we can, because I was a Democrat at the time. I'm a registered independent today. We need to go as far left as we can And once we capture the primary, if we've terrified them enough about the opposition, then here's what will happen. They won't listen
Yeah.
to anything that they'll say. And all we have to convince them of is that the other side is worse than us. That's all we have to convince the people who are in the middle. Well, that seems pretty self-destructive to me. I mean,
Yeah.
I hear that and I go, "Oh my goodness, we're in trouble." Right? And
Yeah.
that's which is why I've been engaged in the reform effort all the way from the 1990s, because it was obvious to me we had a system built upon selecting the lesser of two evils. And unfortunately, politicians know that, and so they play to it. They're willing to sell out to the far left or the far right, knowing that when they do, if they can just convince the public that the other side is worse, they're going to go along with them. And what that does is it loses our aspirational side. What is it that we want to do to make things better, to improve upon things, to take our nation where we need to go? I would love to see a race where we had the best of both worlds competing against one another, and we could choose from the greater aspirational vision. But it's not, it's not lost on me. The odds are we're going to have two nominees that 70% of the public today thinks neither one of them should be the nominee. Right. And when you look at that, you say, well, I don't know why that happens. Well, that happens because that's what the party wants to happen. The party wants that environment to take place. The second thing that I would say, and I'd love your thought on this, I think the similarity between, I don't know liberty or the politics behind it, so I'm not trying to make a statement about them. I'll just take your
Sure.
word in this podcast that they were going through that. But what I do know is that all systems corrupt. That it's just it's an issue of entropy. It effectively over time all systems corrupt unless there's some check and balance that's been put into place that ensures that it goes right. Now, the US has been blessed with a system of checks and balances. We have a balance between the House and the Senate, the legislative body and the executive and the legislative versus the judicial. Those checks on one another have been there. But the political system that we have in place, there's no check and balance on it. In fact, if you were to ask them, the one thing that those two parties agree on is that they want to preserve those two parties. And they're more than willing to allow us to continue to focus on these highly negative issues on both sides. I would argue neither side wants to fix immigration. It's too good of an issue for them in their primary. They want it's everything or nothing. Why would they do that? When you know that if you're going to fix immigration, you have to find something that both sides can agree on. Well, the answer to that is because that's not how most of them get elected. In fact, today, out of the 5,000 seats in America, 70% are elected in their primaries, meaning there is no general election. Why would you want to fix immigration? You need the boogeyman. You need to go back and terrify your base about what it is that the other side's going to do. And immigration is a great place for that to take place. It sounds to me, and listening to your description with liberty, that there was no check and balance on the person who was in charge. He was, he was able to run amok. And one of the most important things in any organization, I don't care if it's a university, our own government, for that matter, a religion, if you don't have a check and balance, the system will corrupt because the individuals who gain control will only care about keeping control. And in keeping control, they will corrupt the organization. That's at least my experience. I'd love your thoughts on either one of those concepts.
Yeah, no, I think you said a lot of really wise things. To your first point, I was just thinking about the Abraham Lincoln quote, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And to your point, the incentive structure right now is for both parties to literally divide our country against itself. That we're tearing ourselves at the seams internally. Most Biden voters, to your point, in 2020 were primarily voting against Trump. Most Trump voters were primarily voting against Biden, and you see that effect in a lot of House races as well. So this is a huge problem. Um, to your point about checks and balances, I totally agree there too, and that's exactly what the main problem was at Liberty. The editors of the student newspaper were fired when they tried to report on things that were going on. The board members were forced to resign because they were opposing Falwell. So it's the lack of checks and balances, and when leaders, like you said, of any institution say checks and balances are pretty inconvenient for me getting accomplished what I want to accomplish, and so I'm just going to go around them. That's when you get the absence of democracy, and you get the potential for authoritarian rule of, again, a given institution, or God forbid, of our country. To your point about uh, the incentive structure to pass something like, say, immigration reform, I think that's true as well. I think that there really are a lot of members of Congress who, if they were here in conversation with us, would genuinely say, I want to pass immigration reform, or whatever the issue is, but there's just not an incentive structure for others in either party to do that. In part because, since the margins in Congress are so slim, since we're a closely divided country and we have a closely divided Congress, compromise to get any major piece of legislation passed is going to be necessary to some degree. Compromise within the parties, and particularly compromise between the parties. And if you're compromising, if you're in an extremely conservative congressional district and you're compromising with liberals, then you're just giving other conservatives a reason to say, "Ooh, this is a weak conservative because he's compromising with liberals." Or the flip side,
Mhm.
if you're on a liberal Democrat and you're trying to compromise with Republicans to get something important done, it won't work, and people in your own party are going to challenge you and maybe run against you in a primary election because you did that. 90% of primary, 90% of elections for the U.S. House in 2022 were uncompetitive, meaning um, uh, the district was either really Republican or really Democrat. And in those kinds of districts, you just don't have an incentive structure to work with the other side, because that's working with the enemy. That's compromising with the enemy, and so Washington just has, even when members privately say, "Man, I really do want to get something done here," it's just not a system that's conducive to getting something done. Again, because there's only two options, and they have that natural built-in incentive to do everything they can to beat the other. And most of what that involves is telling their voters that the other party is, you know, to be feared, and the worst possible thing. And that incentivizes bad actors to run and win. Bad actors who may or may not respect the outcome of elections, or respect norms and institutions in American democracy. So it really creates this unstable system where then you do start to get some serious existential threats to the country. So we take this very seriously and see you know the need for breaking out of the two-party system, not as some like theoretical thing that would be good, but really as an existential as a fight, that we need to find our way out of.
Yeah, that's a profound point. The existing incentive structure doesn't incentivize compromise. And by the way, most of the great legislation that we've ever passed in this country was passed on a bipartisan basis. You go back and look
Yeah,
at the history, and you will find that's true. But
yeah,
when 70% of the seats out of 235 House districts, only 39 are elected in the general election. All the rest are decided in the primary. Well, that means they never have to talk to a Democrat if they're a Republican, or never have to talk to a Republican if they're a Democrat. In fact, they don't have to talk to independents. They only have to talk
yeah,
to people who think just like them. and playing to the more extreme works. And I'm going to give one example. It's a small example, but I think it's important and it makes the point. So I had a member of my city council when I was mayor who was very progressive, and she and I did not agree on much. On the city council, my view was, again, I was a Democratic mayor, but I'm an independent at heart. I look for bipartisan solutions. So we had a number of young people who had been killed in drive-by shootings. We had a lot of violence that had taken place. So I went out to put into place a number of different measures: a curfew law, a kids' gun law, also a school uniform program. And in any event, when I went to advance these programs, when it got to the curfew program, it got to her. She didn't like the curfew idea because she thought that we were going to penalize good kids and that we would be discriminatory and that we would maybe go after Hispanics. But she was willing to on kind of a couple of conditions. And one of the conditions was she didn't want the kids taken to jail. She wanted them taken to the parks department. She didn't want them to get a record. She didn't want it to last. I was able to convince her I was willing to do that if the parents had to show up for the community service work that the kid could do that would expunge their record. Point is, with her support, we got this done. It reduced juvenile violence by 70%. It made a huge difference without giving kids a record. Now, some of the parents were annoyed to death that they had to show up, but we had one young girl, I remember, she was a white teenager, cheerleader, straight A student, was out at 2:30 in the morning. She got picked up and everybody was terrified. They thought, this is the one that's going to blow us up. I did a press conference on her specifically because she was our first one. And I said, hey, first, I don't want my police officers trying to figure out which kids are good kids and which kids are bad kids because I don't know what standard they're going to apply. It's 2:30 in the morning. It's time to pick them up. Second, we took them to a parks facility. All right. At the parks facility, the parents had to show up. When they do community service work, they're going to have to take part in it. And here's the idea. Your daughter shouldn't be out on the street past midnight at her age because good kids die every bit as easily when hit by a stray bullet as quote unquote bad kids do. If you're going to change the way that it works, you have to find a way to bring people towards that center. You identify a problem and then you pull people from both sides, not just pulling them, but utilizing the best ideas that they have, the best that they can contribute. There's a value to people, whether they're conservative, religious, Christian, Jew, Muslim, liberal, progressive. Every person has a value and they bring something to the table, but not in our system. In our system, those groups are just polarized groups who, if they work with one another, they're penalized for it. Dustin, I think the work that you're doing is great work. I think I have a different approach as to how I think the problem solved, but I know this, we're working on the exact same problem.
Yeah, no, that's crucial. And I love this kind of conversation when we can get into those different theories and approaches, and appreciate what you're doing. And we need to figure this out and and move away from the two-party doom loop and the constantly escalating us versus them conflict that's defining our politics today. And we can. I have faith that we can and will, but it takes being really serious and trying to think big about how we can actually get from point A to point B.
Dustin, thank you very much. I appreciate you being part of the Optimistic American today. I know that our goal is to try and rekindle the American spirit. You are exemplary of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. This has been great.
Well, thanks for joining the Optimistic American. If you can look up Dustin's organization, Fix Our House, if you want to try to contact them. And we also want to tell you that, our goal is to try and help renew the American spirit. There are a lot of folks out there working really hard to try to make improvements in a system today that quite simply isn't living up to what's best about America. Again, thank you very much for taking part. We hope you'll push that subscribe button. And if you want, become a premium member at www.optamerican.com/premium. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Now help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned. We can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.